career story some other time. But I am excited to have the time to share with you today some things that I think can help make a difference when it comes to interviewing. So I would like to, now that I have a little sense of who's here, I'd like to get into what I want to cover with you today. So the focus is on behavioral interview questions. But in order to interview with confidence, I think it's also helpful to understand what confidence looks like and what it sounds like. And what I want to share with you today is an insider's view. I've spent decades in corporations working for them and then consulting to them. I do a lot of work with HR organizations, so the topic of hiring is something I deal with a lot. And I'm
Amy,
also,
sorry
hello?
to interrupt you. Yeah, I just wanted to let you know we see all of your original page, not your presenter screen. There you go.
That's interesting. It's swapped somehow. Okay.
That's okay. That happens to me too. I
Thank
just wanted
you.
to let you know.
I'm glad you did. So, the other thing that I want to do today is give you some tools, what I think of as my pro tools, because they're rooted in communication strategy. And it's a new way to think about the conversations you're having when you interview. So, that's my goal for you today is to give you an insider's view and some new tools that you can incorporate in the way that you tell your story. So, how do companies think about interviewing? To them, it is talent acquisition. There is a person who has that title. And the goal of people who work in talent acquisition is to find the right person for the part. And there are people who play a role as sourcers. There are recruiters who can sometimes be involved in that process. And then HR organizations and hiring managers all play a role in deciding who will get the part. And for companies, it's a big investment. They want to get it right. In companies that are small and don't involve recruiters and sourcers, if they're just doing all of this themselves, it can cost about $30,000 when you factor in all the time of the executives who are engaged in interviews to make the decision. And if a recruiter's involved, it can be $300,000 to bring in a senior person. And people aren't productive from day one, so they want you to stay. So this is a big decision that they're making, and they want to get it right. And the way to get it right is to hire for fit. And that's what they're thinking about. Fit. Do you fit? Most important thing is your skills, number one. But I want you to pay attention to the other things they evaluate, especially 4, 5, and 6. Companies want to try to understand who you are, what motivates you, what's going to make you work hard, your values, and your mindsets, how you think about things. And in those initial screening interviews, those short interviews that you have, if you can start to reveal a little bit of that, in addition to talking about your skills, you help them see you as the right candidate for the job, if it's a good fit. So it's important for you to keep in mind that it's not just what you've studied and your expertise that counts. It's who you are and whether you'll make the kind of contribution they're hoping for to their company. So that's the reason they ask behavioral interview questions. They want to see inside you. They want to understand how you think about things. And if you haven't started interviewing yet, you will find every now and then someone will say to you, "So tell me about a time when you had a big challenge. What happened? How did you handle it?" Or, "When in the past have you made a mistake? What did you do about it?" That's how you know they're looking to understand your behaviors, because past behavior is a big predictor of what you're going to do in the future. So when you get these kinds of questions, you want to be ready with an example. And you want to think through long before you start interviewing, what are my examples? Where do I have good stories to tell? that shed light on the person I am and why I'll be good for these jobs. And you want to tailor your stories to the situation and the job that you're interviewing for. And your overall goal, as you think about the way you tell your stories, is to help the interviewers see you in the job, that you are the one that they ought to cast in that part. So let's dig in a little bit deeper. This is a question that I created for a company I was working with. We designed a whole process around hiring and behavioral interview questions because they wanted to make sure they hired people who fit their culture. So this is the kind of question you're likely to get, something about teamwork, because so much of work gets done in teams in industry. And the level of sophistication will vary depending on the company. Some companies do a lot of behavioral interviewing, so you'll get these kinds of questions throughout your interviews. In some cases, it may just be the person from HR who asks these kinds of questions. But if they're good at interviewing, they're going to do something called probe. They are going to want to get to the deeper understanding of the situation. So be aware of that. Yes, you want your story to be ready to go, and you want to think about how you plan to tell it, but you also want to imagine other questions they might ask you, because you're having a conversation. What you don't want is a sense of a back and forth ping pong match that feels more like an interrogation. You want to have a conversation, and good interviewers know how to create that dynamic. So you need to be ready with your stories. And the other key thing here is that there are multiple candidates usually for most positions. So you want to figure out how you can tell your story in a way that stands out. And as we go through this session today, I'll share with you some guidance and principles around how to do that. I want to give you a little bit about storytelling. So what happens after you've gone through this process? Everybody who's been part of the interview team will get together and they'll huddle and they'll think through whether or not you're the right candidate. And I'm sharing with you the different areas of focus that different people on the hiring team will have. And I'm wondering what you notice about that. If you could put into the chat what stands out for you as you compare the kinds of things that the various interviewers care about. Anybody with any thoughts on what stands out here? Yes, team members and hiring managers have more local concerns versus big picture. Absolutely. Team participation is a really key piece of what people are looking for during the interview process, because they want to know how you're going to get along with everybody. So the key takeaway from this is that as you're talking to people, and if you're in one-on-one interviews, you really want to tailor your answers to the people that are listening to you. And that's a fundamental principle of all effective communication. Think about your goal. What are you trying to achieve? Think about who's listening and what they care about. And then the other key word that you see highlighted in orange here is value. Industry is all about value, creating value for investors, creating value for their customers. Every product or service has a value proposition. It's part of the way they think about designing the product and marketing it. So value is the key word for you to remember as you talk about who you are and what you can bring to the company. And I'm going to expand upon this, the importance of value, as I take you through this webinar today. I'm going to stop there to see if there's anybody with a question about anything related to the insider view. I wanted you to have context for how the process works on the inside of a company so that you understood it was about talent and it was about fit and how important tailoring your answers are when it comes to conveying value. Anybody with a question before I move on?
Just a quick one. So how would you perceive what the particular hiring manager or whichever person that you're talking to cares about more? Because of course, people will have different priorities. So is there a way you can possibly find out what they're looking for?
Well, I think back to the comment about this being a conversation, it's perfectly acceptable for you to say to a hiring manager after they've asked you a question or two, help me appreciate what the most important things are from your perspective. What skills do you think are really essential for this job? Would be a perfectly reasonable thing to say after you've exchanged a few back and forths in the beginning of an interview. You can also ask questions like, the people who are really successful here, what are the things that they bring to your organization? Those kinds of questions help give you some insight into what a hiring manager is looking for so that you can tailor your answers.
Thanks a lot.
Sure. Okay. So I want to move here from here to talking about candidate mindsets. What does it take for you as a candidate when you go into an interview to be at your best? And it starts with how you feel on the inside about having an interview. And for most of us, it's an unnerving kind of thing, right? You're on the spot, you're feeling a little bit like you will be interrogated, and it's not an inherently relaxing situation, which is part of what makes it challenging. But the way you choose to think about it will color how you show up. And I highly recommend that you take this quote and think about your choice, because mindset is a choice. The most important decision we make is whether we believe we live in a friendly or a hostile universe. And it's easy to think about interviews as being a little more on the hostile side. But my recommendation to you is that you view it as a friendly exchange. And I want to make one really key point here. If you've got the interview already, they like you. They already like you. So if you can tell yourself that this is a friendly exchange, and by the way, this quote is often misattributed to Einstein. You'll see it on the internet all over the place. He didn't say it. We don't know who said it, but I think it really underscores an important point about the head game we play with ourselves, right? And the reason friendly is so important is that you're at your best when you're sitting around with your friends, right? That's where you're relaxed, you're authentic, you're engaging, your stories are better, you laugh more easily. And if you can feel, and I know this has got to be something you tell yourself because it's not going to really feel that way, but if you can feel like you're sitting there with people you like, people who are going to be your colleagues because they will bring you into their organization. If you can create that mindset, you can change the way you show up. Your body language will be different. And of course, it takes managing your internal narrative, right? And most of us go into interviews and we're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm nervous. Oh my gosh, I'm nervous, right? And all you're doing is fueling up your adrenaline and kicking up the cortisol. But if you can shift that mindset, I'm really excited. I'm excited. This is an opportunity I want. This company sounds great. This job sounds really perfect for me. If you can switch that gear in your head, you've got an opportunity to have some dopamine on your side. So, playing around with how you psych yourself up before you go into an interview is really key. And when people are nervous, they try to contain it. And when you've got adrenaline in your body, you're better off to use it. Make your voice louder, gesture bigger. Don't try to hold it in and hide it because it won't help. It'll just fuel it. So making that mindset shift is really key. And then perhaps the most important mindset is what I started to talk about before, value. You want to ask yourself, how do I show up and show my value to this company? And it takes some thinking about who the company is, what they're trying to do, who's hiring you, whatever you can find out about who's hiring you. How do you show value? And value is about what you can contribute to the company, the team you'll be working on, and the hiring manager. And the way you convey that is through your skills and experience and mindsets, and also the things that differentiate you. And we don't have time today to talk about personal brand and how to really identify the kind of differentiators that you want to use during interviews. But I'll give you one quick example so that you can see where I'm going with this concept. It's think about yourself broadly. I worked with a young woman who did a lot of outdoor wilderness therapy. And in learning her story, I found out she had spent 32 nights in the course of the past year in below freezing temperatures doing the work that she did. And that's a differentiator. Being able to weave into her stories that bit about 32 nights below zero says that she's committed, dedicated, that she's got fortitude. That's the kind of differentiating element of who you are that you want to look for. What are the things that distinguish you, that help show your motivations, your values, and your mindsets? Now I want to introduce the first pro tool, and it's a framework for telling your value story. And it has 4 pieces. I'm going to take you through those pieces one at a time and describe them just briefly. Then I want to show you an example, and then I'm going to unpack it bit by bit to explain the communication strategy behind it. So that's what's coming next. It starts with the job description and then knowing yourself and how well you think you fit the job. And that has to do with your skills, the ones that are most relevant to the job, and what it is about those skills, what it is about doing that kind of work that motivates you. You want to understand your motivation. So for example, if you have done your share of teaching and you're applying for a job where you'll be doing curriculum design, what is it about teaching that you love? Is it transferring knowledge? Is it explaining things and watching the look on people's faces when they get it? What is it that inspires and motivates you about the work? The second piece has to do with why you should work for the company. And this is where your research comes in. Why you're choosing this company. What is it about this company that attracts you? The third piece is to help the people interviewing you see you in that job. Help them believe that you are the right fit. And the fourth piece has to do with priming them to make you an offer. Getting them to think about you as the candidate that they want to hire. And I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about priming. If you haven't read Dan Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, I highly recommend that you do. He, you may know, is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He's got this great book about decision making. And in it, he talks a fair amount about the priming effect. And I want to let you read how he describes it here. So as a communication strategist, I believe you can put this to work to benefit you during interviews because we have associative memory. And when people say things, it evokes related things. So when I take you through the narrative that goes along with the elements of the value story, you'll hear how I'm trying to set the stage to prime the interviewer to feel like I'm right for the job and that I would be great to work with. So that takes me back to the job description because that is fundamentally the starting point. And you want to take a job description, and I know some of you may have some with you. If you have one with you, you might want to pull it out so you have it nearby. What I did here a couple of weeks ago was to take a look for a job at Genentech. I did a lot of consulting for Genentech over the years. Fabulous company if any of you ever want to make a move to the San Francisco Bay Area. Great place to work. Anyway, they had this senior associate scientist role. And if you look at what I've highlighted in blue, those are the elements that are important to the narrative of the value story. So you start with the job description, but then you also need to do your homework. You need to research the company, and as all good PhDs, you know how to be thorough. So it's not just a matter of scanning a few pages on their website. Read their press releases. Go back over the last 6 months or so. Read an earnings press release because the earnings press releases summarize the things that they think are important for investors to know, and you ought to know what they think is important for investors to know. So read their earnings press releases. And then look for things that relate to what you care about and why you're interested in the company. What is it about what they say about themselves? Check for their company culture, read as much as you can, and sometimes there's not a lot on a website. Some companies will post their values, others won't, but look on Glassdoor. Try to understand what you can about their culture because all of that will help you figure out how to connect who you are to what this company is about. And that's key to telling your value story. So what I want to share for you now is a narrative that I recorded using that framework. And I'm delivering it as a monologue said all at once. But the beauty of this value story is that you can use pieces of it in conversation with more than one person. And it also works really well as a thank you note, as a follow-up to an interview. So I'm going to let you listen to this, and then I'm going to want to walk through and unpack it pretty thoroughly for you. Through my PhD and postdoc work, I've really honed my ability to analyze data, and I've discovered the deep satisfaction that I get from using machine learning methods and applying insights to find solutions faster. That's why this opportunity feels so right for me. You know, I saw the news that Genentech just got FDA approval for a new leukemia medicine through an expedited program, and that tells me that speed really matters here, which is why Genentech is a company where I know I can make an impact. I see myself 6 months from now analyzing trial data and helping to identify the mechanisms of response and resistance, learning so much and getting to know all the people on the team. The opportunity to be part of the reverse translation work you are doing is so inspiring to me, and I would be thrilled to work with you on finding new ways to outsmart cancer. So what I did there was integrate those 4 elements to the value story into a conversational narrative. And now I'd like to step through the specifics of the communication strategy behind these pieces. And I want to tie it back to what the interviewers want to hear that would make them want to hire you. I've highlighted deep satisfaction in blue. The key to this statement is for you to reveal what you love, what motivates you, why you enjoy the work. Yes.
I think your slides are not moving.
Yeah, we still see the telling your value story slide right now.
Huh. Which telling your
the telling your value story, and when your recording came on, the FDA grants full approval. That's the one.
Do you see that slide? The telling that one? Okay. Through my PhD and postdoc work, I've really honed my ability to. Do you see your value story pro communication strategy now?
No.
That's very odd.
Perhaps advance another one and then see if it'll come back.
That's what I'm going to do. Do you see it now?
No.
Huh. That is very
I'd
strange.
stop share and then reshare once you're on the correct slide.
Okay. Great suggestion. Thank you. That's very interesting. I thought my phone was off. Okay, let's see. Are you seeing it now?
Yes. Yes.
I'm going to back up a minute here. Okay. So I also wanted to let you know that I have a set of handouts for you that will have all this information. And after I work through a few more concepts, we'll post a link in the chat. So feel free to take notes, but also know that all of the key concepts I'm sharing today will be in your handouts. So the point I want to make here is about tying your skill to what inspires you and motivates you about doing that work, and that it's important to reveal that. You don't have to use my language. You can say it in a way that you would say it, but what you want to show is what it is about that work that you want to be doing. And the reason that's so important is that when people make a hiring decision, they want to bring someone in who's going to love their job. If you love your job, you're going to be your best, you're going to work your hardest, you're going to stay longer. So if you can reveal and talk about your satisfaction and what you enjoy about your work, it goes a long way in helping the interviewer see you as the right candidate. The second piece is about being explicit that you've done your research. I had lunch yesterday with a client of mine who runs HR for a company called Surzan, and we were chatting about the fact that I was doing this webinar today, and she said, "Oh yeah, if we don't know that someone is bothered to do their research, we're not interested in them." So I know you know that you're supposed to do your research. What I'm suggesting is to go deeper than the average person. Look for something really specific that connects who you are and what you care about with the job. That's going to make you stand out from other candidates. The third piece of the value story starts to get into Dan Kahneman's world around priming and helping people see you in the job, and literally saying something like, I can see myself 6 months from now. And then you want to describe what it is you'll be working on and doing based on the job description. And again, you see the key words here: learning, contributing, and inspired. And I'll unpack each one of them for you. The reason it's important to weave in learning is that that shows that you are humble. When you come into an interview, you want to come across as confident, but you also want to make it clear that you know you have things to learn. So that's an important word. It's an important word for interviewers to hear. So is contributing, because it goes back to my point about value. If you talk about how you're going to contribute, you are essentially saying, I know that you need me to add value. So that's another really important word to bring into your interview conversations. And the reason that talking about being inspired is important has to do with this really key thing that a lot of us, especially in STEM, don't think about. As human beings, we are feeling beings who think. It's not the other way around. We're not thinking beings who feel. We are feeling beings who think. And when you read Kahneman's book, you'll come to appreciate why that's so important. It has to do with how decisions get made. And when you can talk using words that inspire emotion, like the word inspired, right? That's an emotionally triggering word. When you do that, you create a different connection. You create a more human connection when you talk in terms that trigger emotions. And that's what you want to do because you're trying to create a connection. This is the beginning of building a relationship, ideally with people who you're going to work with. So the more human your connection, the better. And I think that's a really key thing to keep in mind as science-oriented people. We don't always come from that place, right? We come from this really scholarly place of all the things we know, but they're hiring you as a person. So it's really important to begin to use emotionally triggering words. And I do it again here in the fourth piece, right? I would be thrilled, or I would be so stoked, or I would be overjoyed, whatever word works for you that says so excited. And then to work with you on is a really important phrase because what you're saying is, I want to join you. I want to be here doing this with you. And then find a way to speak to not just the work, like, translational science, but what you're going to accomplish together. Aim at that big goal. Aim at the purpose that that work is done in the company. Because when you do that, you're reminding the person who's interviewing you what they're dedicated to doing. And you're creating a very important human connection in the course of this conversation. So that's the pro value story. Those are the four pieces. And like I said, you don't have to do it as a monologue like I gave you in that example. But as you're in your interviews, to picture yourself in the job and tell that story in that way so that they can picture you in the job. I'm going to stop there and see if anybody has any questions for me. Feel free to just ask. Does all that, I explained all that clearly and it makes sense?
Hi, I have one question.
Yes.
So, how do we show our values to HR because they don't know our skill set? Like, it's easier to show to someone who has a knowledge of our expertise. But how do we exactly show it to HR because they have very, they don't know anything about our skill sets?
So they're interested in you as a person. So they want to know what your interpersonal communication skills are like. They want to know how you get along with other people. They want to know something about your personal values that's connected to the company values. They might want to know that you're a marathon runner and that you're disciplined. That when you talk to HR, they're trying to get a sense for you as a person, because you're right, they're not typically the one who's going to be paying the most attention to your skill set, but they want to know if you're going to fit the company culture. So one of the best things you can do is try to research the culture, try to find out what the company values. And I imagine in some of your other workshops you've learned about doing informational interviewing. In advance of an interview, try to find someone who works for the company that you can chat with and say, hey, I really want to understand your company culture. What makes people valued there? What do you need to do? How do you need to show up to fit in your company culture? When you start to understand that, then you can think about how to illustrate that you'll fit into that world, that you'll contribute to that culture when you're talking to HR. Anybody else before I move on? I'm going to talk a little bit about looking and sounding confident next.
I have a question with respect to, I know you covered it. So with this, if there's a hiring manager, they are interested in more experience of work related, not with, of course, with a team and all those things. So what you showed your value story as a pro communication strategy is more suited with the team workers, right? Co-workers, not with a hiring manager, because hiring manager is more interested in your expertise. Am I
Well,
right?
they're going to ask you questions about your expertise, but all of the things that I've shared with you here apply to the hiring manager. They're the ones who are going to actually hire you. So points number 3 and number 4 are important things to weave in. And when you have been in an interview for a while and you start to understand more about what's required of the job, when you say, listening to you helps me appreciate that 6 months from now I could be doing XYZ, right? So you can weave that in to the conversation as you learn more about the skills. But you're absolutely right. Their focus will be on your skills.
Yeah. If I'm talking to VP, then what will be the strategy? Maybe you're going to tell us in coming
If you're
slides,
ta-
or
if you're talking to a VP, this formula works really well because
Mhm.
you're going to give them a high level sense of the skills that you see that fit the company and the work that you love to do and that you want to contribute to the success of this company by doing that work. So you don't necessarily need to give them all 4 pieces, but they're still going to be interested in how your background and who you are as a person will contribute to the success of the company.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let's spend a little bit of time on looking and sounding confident. I want you to look at this group of folks and pop into the chat the number that corresponds to the person. You'll see 6 folks in a minute, to the person that you think looks most confident. Who looks most confident to you?
Number 5.
Okay. My top choice is number 5, and I'll quickly explain the reason and also some of the science behind why number 5 wins from my perspective. When you're confident, you have a smile on your face, which most of these people do. You're facing forward, you're engaging with the people in front of you, and your feet are firmly planted and forward, and your arms aren't crossed. Crossed arms oftentimes send a message that could be interpreted as arrogance. Now, when you've got a smile on your face and you've got your arms crossed, it doesn't come across quite that way. But the recommendation in the literature is to be more open. And when your arms are crossed, you come across as closed. And then what you don't want to do is grasp your hands together or touch your face or stand in a way where your feet aren't firmly planted because you're off balance. If you look at numbers 2 and 3, you see that they're a little bit on an angle, and also the woman in number 4 who's got her head really far tilted. That doesn't come across as confident, and the literature says that holding your hands or touching your face or your hands in some way suggest some sort of uneasiness. Now, that may not be how you're feeling, but it can be how it's perceived. So what that means for those of us who are operating in Zoom world, now I can't get my slides to advance. Is that you want to remember to have upright posture. And the benefit of upright posture is that it helps give you more air, which you'll need to have a stronger voice, right? If you're sitting like this, and if your head's down and your chin's down, and if you're not looking at the green dot, you're not making eye contact. So in this virtual world, we have to be really careful to keep our eyes on our cameras and to remain in a really upright position. And also notice that my hands are showing, but that's because I'm consciously raising them. If they were by my side and I was gesturing, you'd just see my shoulders wiggling. So it's more natural to be able to see my hands. So in today's world where we have to do this, it's important to be very upright and to raise your hands. I want you to notice one difference between the woman on the top and the woman on the bottom. The woman on the bottom has her head slightly tilted, and she doesn't look as confident as the woman on the top who's looking at us directly. You also notice that the woman on the bottom has her arms pretty close to her side. And in order to appear confident, if you have your shoulders rolled back and down, and it's even a good idea to sit so that you're taking up more space. Let your arms rest on an armrest, but don't sit in a way where you appear to be kind of holding everything close together. So those are some of the things you can do to look confident. What about sounding confident? Take a listen.
The president of the commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community. He wanted the commission to be the executive, and he wanted the council of ministers to be the Senate. No, no.
I chose to share Margaret Thatcher with you because it's known that she went to a voice coach. She knew it was important to sound authoritative, and she understood that she had a tendency to speak in a higher pitched voice and could at times sound a little bit shrill. So she consciously worked on her voice. And I'm not suggesting you have to change your voice, but what I want you to understand about voice is that it is one of the few things we have to keep people engaged when we're interviewing in a little rectangle on a screen. So being conscious of how you use your voice, how you vary it, can make a big difference. And Margaret was known as the Iron Lady. She was considered very authoritative. And as you heard her speaking, she had a rich and resonant voice. Now that comes from being upright, enabling yourself to breathe diaphragmatically deep down in your belly so that you're getting as much air as you can to support your voice. And I highly recommend that you use your phone and listen to yourself, record yourself and just listen and see what you notice about your voice. Do you vary it? I can speak in a higher pitched voice or I can speak in a very low voice. We all have a range in our voices, but sometimes we don't use that range. And that range can be helpful to make a point, to emphasize something that you want people to pay attention to.
Amy, there's a question in the chat, and I think Tracy already answered it, but if you also had any opinions about that, which is in reference to the 6 pictures that you showed about posture. The question is, how do you account for cultural differences? In Germany, number 5 could possibly be considered disrespectful, particularly with older recruiters.
Help me understand why that would be considered disrespectful, because he's too casual?
Yeah, just a bit too casual and doesn't appear a bit more serious.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you raised that. It's important to know who's listening. And if you're in Germany and you know that that would appear too casual, then probably having his jacket flung over his shoulder isn't a good idea, but having his hands down by his side would have been a better posture to have. So it's important to be mindful of cultural differences. Absolutely.
But Amy, I don't think so anybody is going for interview holding a jacket on a shoulder.
No,
right?
I don't think they are.
So being a cool is not a problem in any culture. A smiling face is required, and the most important thing is that you are attentive and you are listening and speaking with confidence, and you know what you are going to talk. I believe this is the main key. Of course, I'm not going to give any interview with holding my jacket on shoulder. Okay, I can hold my jacket if it's a winter in my hand in front, but not on my shoulder anyway.
Right. Yes, exactly. The other thing about sounding confident is to not use too many filler words, but I want to make all of you comfortable. If you happen to say or now and again, that is not a problem. That is being human. Don't feel like you have to have perfect speech. But if you find when you record yourself and you listen that you use a lot of filler words, or that you say the same word over and over again, like some people have a word habit, they'll use basically. basically. And if you have a habit, that's what gets distracting. So if you notice that about yourself, you're going to want to learn to pause and not fill the space. You want to practice pausing so that you don't insert those filler words while you're collecting your thoughts. And the last piece that's really key here is your pacing. And again, varying your pace can be really effective. Talking a little bit fast every now and then, or slowing way down to make a point emphatically. Like you heard Margaret, no, no, no. She slowed down, right? She was being very emphatic. Varying your pace is effective, but not rushing constantly. If you only talk really, really quickly and you never slow down, you will appear less confident. So keep that in mind as well. Now I'd like to ask you to just spend a minute thinking about what we've learned so far today. And in particular, ask yourself, do I know if I do all these things to sound and look confident? And make a note or two about what you can do to look and sound more confident. You can always set up your own Zoom and record yourself and see how well you make eye contact. You can do a mock interview with one of your colleagues and practice and see how you come across. It's really great to have these tools that let us watch ourselves and hear ourselves. Okay. Now I want to move into answering the behavioral questions. And when I think about how overwhelming it is when you know that there are hundreds and hundreds of questions you're likely to be asked, I asked myself, what are the master question categories? And I think there are 5. Companies want to know something about you as a person. They want to know if you're a team player, a good problem solver, if you are an innovator. Can you be creative? Can you be part of something that hasn't been done before? And last but not least, what kind of achiever are you? What do you get done? And I have to say, getting a PhD to me says you are absolutely high achievers. And it's about figuring out the stories you can tell from your past experience to bring that to light. So now I want to take you through the value story topics and the specific areas that I recommend you prepare your behavioral interview answers. So when it comes to personal brand, you want to be able to talk about your differentiators and your work ethic and your strengths and weaknesses. And I know you've spent time on these topics in the past, so I'm not going to spend any additional time. As a problem solver, you can help people see the way you make decisions. You can talk about a mistake that you've made and how you've dealt with that, or a particular challenge that you have. So those 3 topics are part of what you want to have in your behavioral interviewing repertoire of examples and stories. As an innovator, you want to help the interviewers know how you help build support for ideas, your ideas or other people's ideas, because that's what it takes for innovation to happen in businesses. And most businesses care to some extent about being innovative. They also want to understand how you deal with change and failure and what your risk tolerance is. If you're interviewing at a company that's trying to do something leading edge, they are going to care about your ability to take well-informed risks. So look for those kinds of stories. And I imagine in some of your experiments, you've had to make decisions about how to approach something, and you've had to evaluate these sorts of things. Those are good stories to tell. They also want to know how you manage projects, and anybody who's written a thesis has had to manage a big project, so you have those stories to tell. When it comes to being an achiever, they want to know how you motivate other people to get things done, how you work through your own goals, and when you have taken initiative to do something that may have been beyond the scope of what you were asked to do. Those kinds of stories play really well. So do stories about managing priorities, because in business, you will always have way too much to do. And your ability to make good decisions about prioritizing is something that interviewers will want to know about. How do you think about that? Then, when it comes to team player, obviously your communication skills, your interpersonal dynamics, how you've dealt with conflict in the past, how you approach being collaborative, where you've had the occasion to do those things. And then, even if you're not applying for a leadership job, having a leadership oriented story is a great thing to have, because organizations often work informally and we end up in positions where we are helping to lead others to get the job done. So think about your past experience and have a leadership story that you can tell. Now I want to give you one other tool. And I know some of you are familiar with the STAR formula for answering behavioral interview questions. I've simplified it and dug into it again from a communication strategy perspective. And I talk about answering like a pro. Pro is an acronym for sharing the predicament, the response, and the outcome. So it's similar to STAR, but there's some nuanced differences. And the reason I've structured it this way is that we are telling stories when we give these behavioral interview answers. And the most common, well-known story format that everyone is familiar with is the hero's story, something they were up against that they had to overcome. Stories are memorable. So if you can start your answer by describing what were you up against? Was it a deadline, a problem, a disagreement, some sort of failure, a mistake, a big change? What was it you were up against? If you can frame it that way, you begin to tell the hero's story. When it comes to your response, this is an opportunity for you to let your interviewers know how you think and what your mindsets are. So when you articulate your response, you want to not just talk about what you did, what your actions were. You want to talk about your thought process. What led you to do this? And I'll give you an example in a minute. And the outcome is pretty straightforward. As you know, you always want to be as results oriented as you can, but also talk about the impact. What happened as in the way of impact because of what you did? So I'm going to give you an example with an interpersonal communications kind of story, right? So we were meeting with the team and we were trying to make a decision about a vendor. And there were 6 of us, and 5 of us were absolutely in agreement that we wanted this particular vendor. But the 6th person wasn't. And I sat there and I was watching Elena, and I found myself realizing there was something bothering her. She didn't say anything, but I could just tell. I was looking at her face and I could see, and so I stopped and I said, Elena, I am wondering what's going on in your head right now, because I get this sense that this doesn't feel like the right answer to you. Could you help us appreciate what you're thinking? And she spoke up and she started to talk about this one experience she'd had with this vendor and what had gone wrong. And it led the team to have this great conversation about, okay, how do we make sure that doesn't happen in our case? And so in the end, we did go with the vendor. Elena was on board. We learned from her something that made us change the contract so that we were sure we were not going to run into that same situation again. So I told that story in a way where you could see that I watch nonverbal cues, that I pay attention to my colleagues, that I notice if someone's not on board, that I have the courage to speak up in an appropriate way to encourage input. I revealed a lot about myself. Because if I just said to you, so Elena wasn't saying anything, and I just asked her why. I don't give you the same richness. I don't help you see that I pay attention to those things. So the way I'm telling this story is designed to illuminate things about you that will make you of interest to the people hiring you. And I told that story in a pretty flat, kind of dry way. I could make it a lot more interesting, and I'll cover that as we wrap up here today. But I'd like to give you an opportunity to play around with this pro model. And for those of you who are getting ready for interviews, you may have some questions in mind that you've already been working on. You may want to just play around with embellishing on your answers to frame them with this predicament response outcome approach. And for those of you who've yet to play around with this, I'd like you to take a minute, pick one of these questions here, and take a minute to develop a story, get the beginnings of a story. And then if anybody has an interest in sharing what you've written, we'll spend a minute or two on that as well.
I have a question.
Sure.
As I was preparing the answers to these questions a couple weeks ago, I started feeling like, especially for some of them, but I think all of them, I would often feel like my stories were not powerful enough. So when you hear the examples of the stories, right, like this happened with a client or things already in the industry, I feel like in my experience in academia, when I'm asked, well, when did you encounter conflict? Well, there's conflict everywhere all the time during the PhD, and it's hard to address those without sounding negative about the PhD experience for the big ones. And for the smaller ones, I often feel like they're not impactful enough, or maybe I don't know how to phrase them to make them sound as interesting as rich.
Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit about how to make them a little richer. Certain details help to make things a little bit richer. And I could give you the same example I just gave you and tell it to you in a way that made it more interesting and more rich. But the foundation of what you have to work with may have its limits. And you brought up an important point about not raising things that are negative. How do you talk about conflict without being negative? You need to choose really neutral language. You need to be able to say things like, we fundamentally disagreed on the approach, and here's how I explained my point of view to help the other person understand. I mean, you can't, you can't eliminate conflict, but you can try to choose really neutral language and come at it from the standpoint of how you stayed statesmanlike and didn't engage in any sort of combative back and forth. Does that help? Knowing a specific example would make it easier for me to give you an answer, but I'm wondering if I've helped by my general comment here.
Yes, for sure. Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody have an example that they'd like to share of using the pro approach to tell your story and answer one of these questions? Do I have any brave people out there?
So this is pertaining to a problem that we were facing. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the entire group was, my lab, PhD lab, was going in a direction of specifically peptide therapeutics. I have seen firsthand the problems associated with that project. And 3 years into that project, I was barely able to produce anything. And I was the only one who said, okay, I am against it. And actually despised my boss or rather boss despised me for saying that, because he wanted me to do a dogged approach to complete the project. But then I said I would just do something simple in parallel to whatever you're suggesting. I did something simpler. Turns out that brought us a lot of money and patents and papers. And whereas the peptide therapeutic approach never took off even till date. So I do not know if this falls under the category of what you're mentioning, but I was thinking of an example, and this was one of them right on top.
Yeah, I think that lends itself quite nicely. What I would have loved to have heard a little more about is how you came up with the more simple approach. For you to say, as I looked at what I was being asked to do, I found myself thinking, what if we simplified it? Would it work if we did this? Like, help me see inside your thought process around that. But that's exactly the kind of story that I have in mind.
Got it.
Yeah. That your predicament was this lab situation where everybody was
So,
trying to tell you to do things a certain way. Yeah.
so the reason being, I have seen the failure of that peptide therapeutic approach. I figured the same thing could be done using a very simple small molecule, meaning I'm being specific here, a very simpler two-step organic synthesis. And I figured both would land the same result, but only thing is one is really expensive, one is really hard, which is the peptide therapeutics. The other one costed me $50, and that is that led to whatever I mentioned previously. So I looked at the expense, I looked at the ease of approach, and I looked at the failure of the first approach. I looked at the expense of also the first approach.
See, all of that makes that story so much more powerful, and it tells me that you understand why cost matters, why time matters. I mean, it's a much richer story about you and how you think when you integrate that piece about what made you take the action that you did. So that's a very helpful example of illustrating my point that when you reveal that in the course of your conversation, it's a much more meaningful and rich answer. And you're telling me as an interviewer really important things about how you think that are going to help you stand out from other candidates, because the STAR methodology doesn't ask you to do that. It doesn't ask you to reveal your thought process. And I think from a communication strategy, when you do that, you present a much richer picture of who you are. Okay, I'm being a little bit sensitive to time here. I want to ask Sohini to please put the URL for the handouts that I promised into the chat so that you can all download what we've covered today. And I have just one more quick area that I want to touch on, and it has to do with storytelling. And I wish I had more time. There's so much more I could share, but I wanted to give you some key highlights to help you stand out as a candidate. And I'd like to ask you to close your eyes for a minute and just listen. I want you to compare two explanations. And what I'm about to do is just briefly describe some research. And all of you I know have to talk technically about what you've been working on. So this is something I want you to keep in mind. And I want you to listen to the difference between the two ways that I tell you about my research. Whoops, come back. My research is focused on temperature-dependent sex determination of red ear slider turtles. Here's the second version. Turtles are fascinating because whether they become a male or a female depends on the temperature where they live. Very different approaches. The second approach goes back to the point I made earlier about emotion. When I say fascinating, that primes the person listening to me to think about what I'm going to say next as being really interesting and fascinating. I've engaged the amygdala. That's the part of the brain that deals with emotion. So talking about what fascinates you about your research, what surprised you about your research, that will be a much more engaging way to talk to me about your research. And I also, as you heard, put it in more common language. I said the same thing, but I said it in a way that made it more interesting. This is great when you're talking to HR, the people who don't know your science. Using this approach is really helpful. And then you want to tie it back. That's what I've been researching. And in the process, now you want to connect back to what your work means and how it relates to being able to bring value to the company. So that's a tip about how to stand out when you talk about your research, in particular to people who don't know your subject matter. The second tip has to do with storytelling. And stories are better when you help me be in the story with you. So if you were to say, it was the 5th night in the row, I was still at the lab past midnight. It was dark outside and I was really tired. And once again, the experiment didn't work. You have brought me into the story by describing the time and the place when something happened. You could start by saying, I remember sitting with my lab and being the only one who disagreed with the approach we were supposed to take. Has that ever happened to you, that you're the one person who doesn't agree? Well, that was what I was up against. That begins to tell your story in a much more engaging way. You draw me in. And when you use people's names, the story I told, I used a name when I spoke about the one person who wasn't engaging. If I had just said one of my colleagues wasn't engaging, so I asked her a question, it wouldn't have been as engaging a story. So using first names of people is great. Being careful not to disparage anybody is really important. You want to steer clear, and I know you know this, you want to steer clear of sounding negative about other people in particular. You can talk about a situation, but try not to be negative toward other people in any kind of interview question. So thinking about the details of your story, what little pieces of detail can you bring that will make it a richer and more colorful and memorable story? Because people remember stories. And when the huddle happens after you've been interviewed, the things that you do to stand out will make such a difference. So I'd like to ask you to take a moment and reflect on your key takeaways from the webinar today. And if you would please put into the chat 1 or 2 things that stood out for you, something new that you are going to plan to do when you're interviewing in the future. I'd love to see what stands out for you today.
Amy, while people are writing their thoughts in the chat box, I'm not sure if there was a chance to address this question. I just saw it in the chat box, which refers to the how to answer the questions. John, we had asked, could you possibly give an example of a good way to answer question number 6, where you had those 6 pointers?
I'll go back to that while folks are putting things in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Give me an example of a time when you failed. Oh, absolutely. So here's how I would talk about it. I would say that, you know, if I were answering, and I have to think of an example here. It's almost impossible to be a scientist and not have a failure. And it happened to me last March when I had designed an experiment that I thought was going to work, and I only had another 2 weeks before a big deadline. And I got the data back, and I didn't have what I needed. So I sat back and I asked myself, okay, you've only got 2 weeks left. What can you possibly do between now and then to get what you need? Is there an answer? And I came up with 3 different scenarios. And then I went back to my PI and I sat down with her and I walked her through my scenarios and I said, here are the 3 things that I think could potentially work. I'd love your input on which of the 3 you think makes the most sense and whether you think I have enough time, because I'm concerned about whether or not I have enough time. And after our conversation, she just looked at me and said, you don't have enough time. You don't have enough time. You failed. There isn't a way you're going to recover from this. And I can't give you more than 2 weeks. So I just had to come to terms with that. But I felt good about the fact that I tried to think of other solutions, that I had that conversation with her. And I've learned something really important. Anytime you have a failure, you got to have your what you learned, right? What I've learned is, and I don't have a good answer there because I'm making this up as I go, but you want to end with what you learned and the impact it had on you. And you could say, and it was really disappointing because the team was counting on me and I had to go and let everybody know that I wasn't going to be able to deliver on time. But I had those conversations and I let people know that that's what had happened. Owning mistakes and owning failure and showing that you try to learn from it and that you are able to tell other people. You're not keeping it to yourself. Because oftentimes, especially in industry, if something goes wrong that you're doing, it has an impact on someone else's work. So you really want to make sure that you don't leave people in the dark if something isn't going to happen on time.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question about that?
Sure.
Yeah, so how would you also like make sure that you maintain this kind of clear line between being authentic in answering this question and just like giving too much information which might put you down in the list of candidates that they would prefer?
So I'm hearing two parts of your question. One is authenticity, which is how do you tell these stories without showing up in a way that would be negatively viewed, right? Like or that you're overhyping, right? I'm not suggesting that you embellish a story to make it sound better. I'm suggesting that you think about how to tell the story in a way that it sounds as good as it can. And if
No, I'm so sorry. That's not what I meant.
well, you
So
also asked about detail, right? Like how much
yeah,
detail?
no, I meant in the sense that so how do you answer this question truthfully and authentically, but also make sure that you don't like get a bit carried away and give too much information and it makes them view you negatively?
Okay, so the concern is that you get into too many details about the circumstance and then it yeah, okay. So detail is something you want to pay really close attention to. And when you're working on developing your stories, you want to make sure that you don't tell too many details. You want to tell important details that send the message you want to send. So in my examples, I was giving you details to send the message that I had the courage to go to my PI, that I took initiative to try to solve the problem in a few different ways and to talk about those options. Those were details that reflected on the message I wanted to leave behind as a result of telling the story. So those are the kinds of details you want to use. And you don't want to tell every single what happens next kind of detail. You want to summarize it in a way where you can anchor to the key point you want the interviewer to take away from your story. And one way you can do that is to practice and get somebody to listen to your answer and then ask them, did I give you too much detail? What do you take away from my answer? What does my answer reveal about me? And if they say the things that you intended them to hear, well, you were brave enough to talk to your PI. Well, you were someone who tried to figure out solutions on your own, not just coming to them with a problem. Like if they say those things back to you, you know you have the right details.
Thanks a lot. That's a great tip.
You're welcome. I've spent my whole career helping people think about what to say and how to handle communication situations. And I have so much more information. In fact, if you want to keep in touch, shoot me an email or you can pop your email in the chat and I will periodically send around more information as I develop it. I'm happy to share because I really, one of the reasons I do this is because I've come to figure out after my many years of corporate work and consulting work that I just love helping people be successful. And there's nothing like the feeling that you got the job to feel like you've succeeded. So it gives me great pleasure to be able to spend time with you and teach you the things that I know and bring you what I hope is a new way of thinking because most of us just talk. We don't think strategically about why we're saying what we're saying, how we're saying what we're saying, who we're saying it to, and what they're going to want to hear. You all have another really interesting advantage when it comes to HR and being valuable to them. You're part of a STEM peers network. Like, they are always looking for good candidates. So, one of the ways you could really stand out with an HR person is to say, if you have other open positions, do you know about STEM peers? We post these jobs. There are some great people that I know that perhaps would want to work here. If you said that to an HR person, you would add tremendous value. Because remember what I said, it's costly for them to find people. So keep that in your back pocket as a little gift you can give to the HR people in your world. And I just have one more thing that I want to leave you with before I open the floor for questions. So bear with me as I get to my last slide here. And it's a quote from a colleague and client of mine who's been a chief people officer and head of HR for years, Gwen Carskadden. And I want you to read this because it's really important and it goes back to what I've been saying today. My focus has been on how to communicate to connect, because your technical skills are rock solid. They're there. But the part that you can talk about that reveals who you are as a person and helps you connect with people is what will make a difference. When they're sitting around the table, the interview team is sitting around the table, you want them to remember you. You want them to think about your values, your motivations, and your mindsets because you've shared them. And you want to find a way to be as comfortable and friendly and human as you possibly can, because people hire people. They hire people they like, and they will like you if you help them see who you are as a person. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And it's been a lot of fun being able to do it. So I'm happy to spend as much time as you'd like to answer any questions that have come up as a result of our conversation today.
We have some lovely comments in the chat talking about how today's talk helped everybody. Amy, if you can see them.
I'm looking now. Thank you. Oh, I love what you added, Tracy. Yes. I think that's really a key point. Sometimes you want to give the whole story, but test to see if people are interested in hearing more. Yes, I think that the energy that you bring, I have to do this myself. When I get ready to do this with all of you, I have to say to myself, I'm really excited to do this. Instead of, oh, I'm really nervous. I hope I remember my slides and I hope things work the way they're supposed to. It's really easy for us to get inside our heads in a way that isn't helpful. So try to avoid that. Well, and if there are any other questions, I'm happy to stay on and answer. Otherwise, it's been delightful being able to spend the time with you today. And please reach out if I can be of help. Feel free to drop your email in the chat if you'd like, or you can reach me at amy@championingscience.com. I think my email is on the handouts that you have. And I would love to know what happens as a result of doing some of the things we've talked about today. So I'd love to hear how it's worked for you.
Would you be comfortable connecting on LinkedIn, Amy?
Oh, absolutely. Please.
Great. Thank you.
I do post things periodically on LinkedIn.
If there are no questions, Amy, thank you so much. This has been extremely insightful, and just going by all the comments in the chat box, you can see how much people have, how much knowledge people have gained on such an important aspect of in the interview process. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's great to be with you all. Enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
I'm going to stop the recording now.